My name is Ron Tatro. I'm the Veteran Service Officer for the towns of Douglas, Uxbridge, Northbridge, and Sutton. And I can't say thank you enough for showing up here today. I'll be the master of ceremonies. What we're going to do is we're going to begin with the posting of the colors from the Douglas High School Band. Thank you. We're gathered here today to rededicate our Douglas Center War Memorial. We'll first start with our invocation by Pastor Tony Matchuk from the First Congregational Church.
We gathered here today to honor the men and women who have served in our armed services and given so freely of themselves in order to defend these words that we all know so well. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These famous words from the Declaration of Independence set in motion a national consciousness that's committed to defend and declare the ideal of freedom here and abroad that has endured for over 200 years. With this freedom, though, there comes a great responsibility. That responsibility belongs to each one of us. It is ours first to value it as the gift that it is, given to this nation by God, and second, to defend it, not only for the good of our nation, but for that of the world as well. To those upon whom that responsibility to defend and protect these freedoms has fallen, we thank you and we honor you for your service and your sacrifice. Our veterans have given more for us than most of us could ever know. As we gather and spend time together today, let us reflect for those who have given their lives so that we might live today. We honor them. For those parents and spouses and brothers and sisters, friends and loved ones who have suffered loss on our behalf, we mourn with them. For those who carry physical and mental wounds that may never heal, we pray for their healing. For the many families that bear the burdens and difficulties that come as a result of the sacrificial service of our veterans, our hearts and our support be ever with you. Let's pray. Oh, great God, we thank you for the gift of liberty, which we so enjoy. And as we remember and we reflect today, let our hearts be stirred with great appreciation for our veterans, for their service and for their sacrifice and for the gift that they have fought to protect, for that which they have defended. We thank you for these things. In your name I pray. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor. As we gather here today, we're going to rededicate this monument. This monument is one of two monuments that were dedicated on September 16th, 1908. This specific monument was placed here in remembrance of the unknown who served in the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and the Spanish-American War. There are many people that we need to thank for this monument. There are several people I'd like to recognize here today. Senator Richard Moore, who helped us make this possible through the grant we received through the Department of Veteran Services. Mike Gazinski, our town administrator, who was also an instrumental part in writing the grant, which provided us with the grant that we needed to refurbish the cannons. John Zivkak, sorry, John. United States Marine Corps. He's one of our instrumental parts of our VFW, and he is the driving member of the VFW who keeps these projects going within the town. Sergeant David Brown and his family. Sergeant Brown dedicated probably close to 100 hours alone on refurbishing the cannon, which you'll learn more about later in the ceremony. The Douglas Board of Selectmen, the Douglas Monument and Memorials Committee, which is newly formed, which helped, make this possible. The Douglas High School Band, the Douglas Senior Center, obviously the VFW Post, Joseph J. Mitchell VFW Post, and last but not least, our Boy Scouts and Cub Scouts. For those of you that don't know, the week before Memorial Day, usually the Thursday, sometimes it's raining, sometimes it's not, we gather here, we start right here, and those fine young boys over there, soon to be young men, hopefully soldiers and veterans someday, they help us remove all the old and tattered flags throughout the town and place the new flags in memorial of all of those that served and all of those that paid the ultimate sacrifice. So I can't not thank them for all the work that they've done. Our first guest speaker is Senator Richard Moore.
People of Douglas have a long and very proud history of answering the call to arms. It is therefore most fitting that we gather here at this monument on this Veterans Day to rededicate not only the monuments to those from Douglas who served, but through this act of rededication, remember and honor the patriotism and courage of all with whom they served in the cause of freedom. Men of Douglas marched with the Minutemen before we were officially a nation to respond to the advance of British regulars on Lexington and Concord, where the shot heard round the world was fired. During the Revolutionary War, 75 men from Douglas served the country. The Commonwealth's war records note that in proportion to its inhabitants, Douglas was represented by more men than any other town in Worcester County during the Civil War, or War of the Rebellion as it was known. Douglas also contributed the most money on the basis of its valuation to the war effort. 242 Douglas men marched off to war from 1861 to 1865. Of that number, it's reported that there were 26 dead, 4 missing, 12 wounded, and 4 prisoners of war. When the 2 monuments for Union soldiers were first dedicated in 1908, there were veterans of the Civil War still living in this community, and they participated actively in the dedication during that September. There have been many sons and daughters of Douglas who continued to answer their country's call in the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, and the more recent conflicts in the Persian Gulf, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Undoubtedly, there are still those who call Douglas home, even on this Veterans Day, who are standing watch and protecting our freedom somewhere in the world. Veterans, past and present, indeed all who served, whether from Douglas or beyond, have a place in the hearts and prayers of all of us today. Duty, honor, country are more than words to these true heroes. They have values to be lived, and if necessary, for which to die. It may be only by chance that Veterans Day and Thanksgiving both fall during the month of November, but in many ways the synergy is especially appropriate. Every American owes a huge debt of gratitude to all who have served their country in the cause of freedom. More than on a designated holiday, such as this Veterans Day, we must remember them every day with reverence and respect and thank them for their courage and their service. May God bless all of our veterans, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you.
Our next guest speaker will be Selectman Tim Bonin.
Good afternoon. Before I begin, I'd just like to personally thank each and every veteran that is in the audience today. Director of Veteran Services, Ron Tatro, for your vision. Thank you. Senator Moore for shepherding this forward, and Mike Kaczynski for helping with the grant process and helping us make today possible. I'd also like to recognize the Highway Department for helping us put these rifles to where they belong. I know Selectman Hal Davis will speak a little bit more about the sacrifice that Douglas residents have made through the years on behalf of all of us. So I'd like to take my time to paint a picture of what I see here today. To do that, I'd like to share you with a brief story about a family vacation that I, my wife Meredith, took our children on, Caitlin and Ryan, last year on a whirlwind tour of Pennsylvania. We started at Hershey Park, at Dutch Country, went to Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and ended it at Gettysburg. At Gettysburg, we took a tour run by the National Park Service. Our first stop took place deep behind the Confederate lines. The tour guide himself tried to paint a picture of what we were looking at. Each of us knew the grounds were hallowed, adorned by monuments, green, plush grass, rocks, and of course the Blue Mountains on the horizon. We stopped at General Lee's monument. As first-time visitors, we walked in his shoes. Like him, the picture about what was unfolding was unclear. His cavalry hadn't checked in for some time, and he had very little knowledge of the whereabouts of many Union forces. On the tour, you begin to understand the clash that was about to unfold. We visited Devil's Den, and the idea that fighting was real, that it was brutal, and the stakes were getting higher and higher. The tour eventually takes you to the Union side. We stopped at a place called Little Round Top. There, a man from Maine named Chamberlain and his men defended the hill against the relentless attack from the south. General Lee knew that if he were to break Chamberlain's stronghold, that he'd be able to control the road heading to Baltimore, he'd cut off supplies, and he'd be able to overrun the remaining Union forces with a straight shot for the north. Our final stop took us to a place called what is commonly known the high water mark of the Confederacy, a place where Union soldiers defended, repelled, and killed tens of thousands of Confederate soldiers taking part in an attack known as Pickett's Charge. I have no doubt that the Griffin rifles that we see here, not necessarily these, but these rifles contributed to the success of the defense of our Union and the ideals that we all share. Having these two rifles here in our town is an awesome thing. Being able to see these rifles every day, as well as our monument, is an awesome thing. So today, let's all pledge never to forget that these rifles were instruments used in an incredibly important war, and that we are incredibly fortunate to have them on our town common. Equally important, let us all remember that they only worked because of the courageous men that used them. Thank you.
To the Highway Department, trust me, I didn't forget you. I was saving the best for last. Our next guest speaker will be Selectman Hal Davis.
Good afternoon, veterans, and to everyone else in attendance. I thought it was appropriate, since we're rededicating the Griffin rifles here, that we say a few words about the Civil War and its impact on Douglas. It was originally referred to as the War of Rebellion, and I think perhaps that shows the ferocity of what the Civil War really was. 620,000 people died, soldiers died in the Civil War. 13,942 from Massachusetts. If you added up all the deaths in all the wars previous to the Civil War and after the Civil War up to Vietnam, they would not equal the deaths incurred during the Civil War. If you took the percentage of population that existed at that time and compared it to the population today, there would be 2 million deaths today to represent what the impact was on the Civil War when it concluded in 1865. Douglas contributed at least 250 men, and as was pointed out by Senator Moore, the town actually contributed funds as bounties to encourage soldiers to enlist for a 3-year period, and the town also supported the families of those soldiers. You know, we look at these instruments of war which seem relatively puny in comparison of the destruction we can wrought today, but we should take a moment to think again of the tremendous ferocity of the Civil War and all it has meant to this country since then, that we've healed the wounds from that. It seems like ancient history, but it really isn't that long ago. The last Civil War veteran died in 1956. And if you were 58 or older today, I think that's the numbers, you would have been alive when the last Civil War veteran died. So it's appropriate that we dedicate these rifles here today and remember especially the deaths of the Civil War because of what we're doing here today, and of course all the sacrifices of our veterans on behalf of this great country. Thank you very much.
They're fine. Trust me, you'll understand in a few minutes. We'll now have the Gettysburg Address read by Noah Boudreau.
President Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, November 19, 1863. 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But, in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little know, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus so far nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Thank you, Noah. I'd like to recognize our veterans. First, if we have any veterans in the crowd, could you please just raise your hand so you can be recognized, please? I want to thank you personally for your service. I have one special friend I'd like to thank. He served in World War II. His name is Frank Susky. He's a close friend of mine. We've spent a lot of time together, driving back and forth to Boston, to the VA, and other conversations on the phone with his beautiful wife, Alice. And I just can't thank Frank enough for being here today. I'd like to thank our VFW, led by Commander David DeLuca. I'd like to thank the Marine Corps League from Uxbridge and the Uxbridge VFW who showed up here today, and the Legion Riders who showed up here today. As I said earlier, the purpose for this rededication is not only for the cannons, but to rededicate our history and these two monuments we have in town. This monument and the monument that stands at the corner of Main and North Street were dedicated on September 16th, 1908. Simultaneously, they had two ceremonies. The Grand American Republic had a ceremony, and they had a ceremony here at Douglas Center. And the reason I say these two here are fine, I should say it's very difficult for me not to make this personal. I grew up in that house right over there. So these cannons not only served as a seesaw from time to time, we had great memories playing war against our foes who were hiding in the cemetery, some of who are on the highway department in the form of John Furno and his family, who grew up down the street. But also I've grown over the last 31 years, my time in the military, to respect not only our history, not only rededicating our history so we don't forget, but also the pride we have in being able to bring something like this piece of history back to life So I'd like to briefly do is just talk to you about these. They're rifles. They're not cannons. I've been greatly educated in this over the last few months. They're the Griffin rifle. They were designed by John Griffin with an EN. They were commonly referred to by the Union soldiers as the Griffin rifle with an IN. For the life of me, I haven't been able to find that out in the history, why that was, but they were commonly called the Griffin 3-inch rifle. They shoot a 10-pound rifled round. They're accurate to 1,800 meters. For those of you who don't know how far that is, John and I were talking about it the other day. It would reach his house, which is down past the railroad tracks on Southeast Main Street. It took 5 men to operate these rifles, and it was quite the operation. We're lucky enough to have 2 of them. They were built by the Phoenixville Iron Works Company of Pennsylvania. The can of history that we've opened in this project is incredible. I reached back to the former Phoenixville Iron Works Company in Pennsylvania, found that they were bought out by another company, and they put me in touch with a historical society who tracks each and every one of these 3-inch rifles. These 3-inch rifles are now permanently on a historic register. This is number 71 and number 317. This one weighs 815 pounds. That one weighs 816 pounds. How do we know this? Well, Dave Brown and I spent many hours. Well, Dave spent a lot more hours than I did, but we spent several hours trying to figure out what the numbers were, and after researching them, the number 71 and 317 are their actual serial numbers. There were approximately 1,400 made. 90 are still standing on the battles of Gettysburg today. 3 are in Louisiana that were captured by the Confederate soldiers, and this was the prized rifle, ordnance rifle, during the Civil War. So it was great pride being part of this project. Senator Moore touched on the history of the town of Douglas, and it's not just the town of Douglas, it's the Blackstone Valley, and it's this area of our country. And it shows right here the pride of these small towns. I will tell you, having spent time in harm's way, the brothers in arms that I spent with, the majority of them come from small towns just like this. The Douglases, the Uxbridge, the Framinghams, the small towns like Burrillville, and we make up the majority of the fighting force. I'd like to speak about 2 of those that served during the Civil War. They're buried right across the street. Between 1861 and 1865, 242 served from the town of Douglas. To put that in perspective, there were 2,200 people that lived in the town at that time. More than 10% served. 26 died. 4 are still missing, were never found. 12 were wounded, and 4 were held as POWs. 2 that I'd like to speak about. The first one is Myron W. Starrett. Now, not much is known about Myron other than he was killed at Port Hudson. On all accounts, he was lost and was unaccounted for several months. Several Confederate soldiers were captured, and they disclosed that Myron Starrett was killed at Port Hudson on May 27th, 1862. He's buried in the Douglas Center Cemetery. He has a beautiful gravestone, and we line up there every year right next to his gravestone when we present our colors during our Memorial Day Parade. The next one, as we would refer to them in the Army, and I think my brothers in arms would trust me when I say this, this guy was a stud. Orlando F. Carpenter. He enlisted in the Army in September 31st, 1861. He fought in the battles of Roanoke, New Bern, Kingston, Goldsboro, and Plymouth. He was then released from duty from the Army. If that weren't enough, he came home back to the town of Douglas, got his $100 stipend in gold, and decided he was going to re-enlist on January 20th, 1864. He then fought in the battles of Point of Rocks, Virginia, Drury's Bluff, and was wounded at Cold Harbor in June of 1864. Orlando was then taken to Washington, D.C. for treatment, where he eventually succumbed to his injuries. He died on June 16th, 1864, and he too is buried right across the street in the Douglas Center Cemetery. In closing, I thought it would only be appropriate to read a part of a poem. And as I said earlier, it's hard not to make this personal. My wife and I were lucky enough to find this book. It's called The Brave Days of Old, believe it or not, at the Grafton Flea Market. Somebody had a book that was 150 years old. for $12, and it's all poems about the Civil War. And on the back of your programs, I'd just like to read an excerpt from one of those poems called The Battle. On every hill, the guns are still. Above the sighing winds, alone is heard the dying soldiers moan. We wonder why the brave men must die, and cry to God who rules above, to keep us in the bonds of love.
What brings you here today? Honor the dead! Carry on. Grenade! Aim! Fire! 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 Freeze! Aim! Turn!
Ladies and gentlemen, before we conclude, you all have a flag, and I'm going to explain to you the importance of those flags at this time. Besides the fact that we'll defend them no matter what, placed under this ordnance rifle right here is a time capsule. In that time capsule is a flag, the same flag that you carry here today. So this is very important for you little ones here. 100 years from now, they're going to lift this cannon up. They're going to open up that time capsule. There's going to be a flag in there. It's going to have 50 stars on it, and it's going to have 13 stripes, red and white, with a blue field. Hopefully, there'll be the same amount of stars, the same amount of stripes. We'll never know. Also in that time capsule is one of the Douglas axes, one of the more beautiful ones, donated by Adam Furno and his family. All the information as to what was included in the project, including all the pictures, and also a flag that was flown over Afghanistan during a special operations mission, direct action special operations mission, on the anniversary of September 11th, 2011. So it's important that you try and keep those flags in a special place. You try and pass them down throughout the history so that 100 years from now, maybe if just one person comes back with that flag standing here and says, this was one of those flags that was here 100 years ago, and then we've done something great here today. Lastly, I cannot thank the Highway Department Superintendent John Furno, Dave Furno, Adam Furno, Ernie Marks, Ray Began, and Mark Toll enough. They worked countless hours digging the foundations for these beautiful pieces of artillery. They cleaned the common, and again, they helped place the cannons here and just make this such a beautiful memorial. Lastly, Whiten's Monumental Works, Tom Delfonte, his crew Pete Filozzi, and Dave Calkins, they came here and actually placed the cannons for us. These pedestals were built in Vermont. They actually took one of the cannons up to Vermont. They're precisely built to these cannons. So again, can't thank them enough. In closing, I want to thank you all for joining us here for Veterans Day. We will be having a brief reception at the VFW Hall afterwards. You're more than welcome to join us. We were just planning on 1 or 2 boxes of Joe. It looks like we'll be making a couple of runs. We'd be happy to have you join us. At this time, we're going to be retiring the colors. Would you all please stand while we retire the colors? Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for coming. That concludes our ceremony. Thank you.